My wife tricked me into naming our son after her childhood friend, who was actually her dead ex-boyfriend. My wife Rachel wanted to name our son after her childhood friend, who died in a motorcycle accident. She said his name was Christopher, and he meant a lot to her growing up. She cried when she asked, said it would honor his memory, said it would mean everything to his parents who were like second family to her. I agreed because I wanted her to be happy. We named our son Christopher James. She posted about it everywhere. How meaningful it was. How Christopher would have been such a proud godfather. How his spirit would watch over our baby. I thought it was a bit much, but grief is complicated. Then at Christopher's first birthday party, Rachel's college roommate Ashley got drunk and made a comment. She said it was beautiful that Rachel found a way to keep her first love alive. That Christopher would have wanted this. That their love story deserved a happy ending, even if it was through our son. I pulled Ashley aside and asked what she meant. She went pale, tried to backtrack. But after 3 more drinks, she told me everything. Christopher wasn't Rachel's childhood friend. He was her boyfriend for 4 years. They were planning to get married. Had already picked out rings. Then he died 6 months before Rachel met me. She never told me. Not when we dated. Not when we got engaged. Not when we had the name conversation. Not when I stood in that hospital room and agreed to name my son after her dead ex-boyfriend. I confronted Rachel that night after everyone left. She broke down, said she didn't know how to tell me, said it shouldn't matter because Christopher was dead, said she loved me now and that's what counted, said I was overreacting about a name. But it wasn't just the name. She had photos of him hidden in our closet, his jacket in a storage box, love letters she still read. She visited his grave every month and told me she was at book club. She'd been lying our entire marriage. I couldn't look at my son without thinking about it. Every time someone called his name, I remembered. Every time Rachel posted about our little Christopher, I knew she was thinking about him, her dead boyfriend, the love of her life who I could never compete with. I filed for divorce when Christopher turned 2. Rachel fought it hard. Said I was destroying our family over nothing. Said I was jealous of a dead man. Said I was being petty and cruel. The custody battle was ugly, but the judge didn't like the deception either. I got primary custody. Rachel got weekends. I legally changed my son's name to James. His middle name became his first name. Rachel lost it. Said I was erasing Christopher's memory. Said I was a monster. Said their love deserved respect. I didn't care. My son deserved better than being a living memorial to his mother's ex-boyfriend. Rachel spiraled after the divorce, quit her job as a physical therapist, moved back with her parents, spent all her time creating a non-profit in Christopher's memory, motorcycle safety awareness. She barely saw James during her weekends, too busy with fundraisers and memorial rides. I raised James alone for 5 years, coached his soccer team, taught him to ride a bike, helped with homework every night, built a good life, started my own consulting firm, made enough to buy a nice house in a good school district. James thrived. Straight A student, popular kid, happy kid. He doesn't even remember being called Christopher. Doesn't know the story. Just knows his mom is sad a lot and doesn't come around much. Then last month, Rachel contacted me out of nowhere. Not about James. Not about wanting more time with him. She needed money. The nonprofit was failing. She'd spent everything on it. Her parents were done supporting her obsession. She wanted to create a memorial garden at the park where Christopher used to ride his motorcycle. A place for grieving families. A healing space. She needed $50,000. She actually said I owed it to her. That I'd destroyed her life by taking James. That I'd dishonored Christopher's memory by changing our son's name. That the least I could do was help her build something beautiful in his honor. The audacity was breathtaking. She wanted me to pay for a memorial to the man she'd loved more than me. The man she'd tried to secretly name our son after. The ghost that destroyed our marriage. I told her to come by the house. We'd discuss it when she picked up James for her weekend. She showed up looking terrible. She looked worse than I'd seen anyone look in years. Her jeans hung loose around her waist like she'd borrowed them from someone twice her size. The shirt she wore had a stain near the collar that looked days old. Her hair needed washing, and her eyes were red and puffy with dark circles underneath that makeup couldn't hide anymore. She held a folder against her chest with both hands and stared at the doormat instead of looking at me. She asked if we could talk inside, and her voice came out scratchy and weak. I stepped back and opened the door wider. My anger at her request for money disappeared for a second because I was genuinely worried she might collapse right there on my porch. James sat at the kitchen table with his math homework spread out in front of him. He looked up when we walked in, and his whole face brightened for just a moment before he registered how his mom looked. His smile faded fast. Rachel tried to smile back at him, but something went wrong with her face and it came out twisted and strange. James pulled back in his chair slightly and glanced at me with confusion in his eyes. I told him to take his homework upstairs so his mom and I could talk. He gathered his papers and books quickly and practically ran for the stairs. The relief on his face was obvious. He didn't want to be near whatever was happening here. Rachel sat down at my kitchen table in the same chair she used to sit in when we were married. She put the folder down in front of her and immediately started crying. These weren't the angry tears from our divorce or the manipulative crying she'd done in court. This was the kind of sobbing that comes from someone who has nothing left. Her shoulders shook and she covered her face with her hands. She told me between gasps that the nonprofit was completely bankrupt. She owed $80,000. Her parents wouldn't help anymore. She was getting kicked out of her apartment next month. The memorial garden was supposed to save everything by bringing in big donors, but nobody wanted to fund a failing organization run by someone who could barely function. She said the words like she was confessing to murder. I didn't know what to do, so I made tea. My hands moved on their own while my brain tried to process everything. She destroyed our marriage with lies. She tried to turn our son into a living memorial for her dead boyfriend. And now she wanted me to rescue her from the mess she made. I filled the kettle and got a mug from the cabinet. My consulting firm was doing well, and I had money saved up, but this wasn't my problem to fix. Rachel took the mug when I set it in front of her, and her hands shook so badly that tea sloshed over the rim. She told me she hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days because every dollar went to keeping the nonprofit office open. She pushed the folder toward me. Inside were financial statements showing the complete disaster she'd made of Christopher's memorial organization. Red numbers everywhere, unpaid bills stacked up, loans she couldn't repay. Rachel admitted she thought starting the nonprofit would help her heal. She thought it would give Christopher's death meaning. She thought his parents would be proud of how she honored his memory. Instead, it became an obsession that cost her everything. Her career as a physical therapist, her home, her relationship with James, her mental health. She looked at me with desperate eyes and said she knew she had no right to ask for help. She was drowning and didn't know how to stop. I sat across from her at the table and watched her fall apart in my kitchen. I told her I wasn't giving her $50,000 for a memorial garden to my ex-wife's dead boyfriend. Her face crumbled like I'd hit her. She started talking faster and more frantically. The garden would honor all motorcycle accident victims, not just Christopher. His parents were counting on it. It was the only way to make his death mean something. I cut her off and said Christopher's death already meant something to the people who actually knew him. It didn't need a garden funded by the man she lied to for years. My voice came out harder than I meant it to, but I was tired of this. Tired of Christopher's ghost haunting my life even after our divorce. Rachel's face changed from desperate to angry in seconds. She accused me of being cruel, of never understanding grief, of destroying everything good she tried to build from tragedy. She said I took James away from her, changed his name to erase Christopher's memory, turned her son against her through years of keeping them apart. I felt my own anger rising hot in my chest. I reminded her that she named our son after her ex-boyfriend without telling me the truth. That she lied about who Christopher was. That she chose a dead man over her living family. That she visited his grave every month while telling me she was at book club. That she kept his jacket and love letters hidden in our house. My voice got louder with each point. James appeared in the doorway. He asked if everything was okay because he could hear us arguing from upstairs. Both Rachel and I stopped talking immediately. Rachel tried to pull herself together, but she was shaking and tears streamed down her face. James looked scared seeing his mother this broken. He asked me quietly if his mom was sick. I realized he'd never seen her like this before. She usually managed to pull herself together enough for their brief weekend visits. She never showed up looking this destroyed. I told James his mom was going through a hard time, but she'd be okay. The words felt like a lie coming out of my mouth because Rachel clearly wasn't okay and might not be for a long time. Rachel reached toward James like she wanted to hug him, but he stayed close to me. He looked uncertain and frightened by how intense she was being. She told James she loved him more than anything. Her voice came out too loud and desperate. James looked even more uncomfortable because her emotion was too big for a 7-year-old to handle. He pressed against my side and kept his eyes on the floor. I suggested Rachel stay in our guest room tonight because she was in no condition to drive. James needed to see his mom wasn't completely falling apart. Rachel looked shocked by the offer, like she expected me to throw her out. She nodded and wiped her face with her sleeve. James relaxed a little when I explained his mom would stay overnight. I sent him back upstairs to finish his homework while I helped Rachel get settled in the guest room. That night, after James went upstairs to finish homework and get ready for bed, Rachel and I sat across from each other in my living room, where we used to watch movies together back when we were married. She looked smaller somehow, curled into the corner of my couch with her arms wrapped around her knees like she was trying to hold herself together. I sat in the chair across from her because sitting next to her felt too close. Too much like we were still a team instead of two people connected only by a 7-year-old kid upstairs. Rachel picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. and didn't look at me when she started talking. She said the nonprofit was never really about helping motorcycle accident victims or their families like she told everyone. It was about keeping him alive in her mind, because letting go felt like killing him all over again. Her voice came out flat and empty, like she'd rehearsed this confession 100 times in her head, but never thought she'd actually say it out loud. She told me she visited his grave 3 times a week, every week, for the past 6 years. She talked to him like he could hear her, asked him questions about what to do with the organization, told him about James even though she barely saw James herself. I sat there trying to process what she was telling me and realized I wasn't dealing with someone who made a series of bad choices. I was dealing with someone who never processed her grief at all, who let it eat her alive from the inside until there was nothing left but the obsession. Rachel finally looked up at me with red eyes and said she knew it was sick and wrong, but she couldn't stop. Every time she tried to focus on something else, she felt like she was betraying him, abandoning him, letting him die a second time. The silence stretched between us heavy and uncomfortable until Rachel started talking again, this time about James. She said she hadn't been a real mother to him because every time she looked at James, she thought about the name I took away. She said James was supposed to be her connection to him, her way of keeping him present in her daily life, and when I changed the name to James, it felt like I'd erased him completely. Her hands shook when she talked, and I could see how much this admission cost her. She said she knew it was wrong and sick and completely unfair to James, but she couldn't separate her son from her grief no matter how hard she tried. I felt anger rising in my chest again, because this was exactly what I'd been afraid of all along. I told her that's precisely why I got primary custody and changed his name, because she was using our child as a memorial instead of loving him as himself. I said James deserved a mother who saw him as a person, not as a placeholder for a dead boyfriend. Rachel flinched like I'd slapped her, but she didn't argue. She just nodded and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She said she understood why I did what I did, even if it destroyed her at the time. She said she'd been so angry with me for years, but sitting here now she could see I was protecting James from her own sickness. I asked Rachel when she last saw a therapist because clearly she needed professional help, not my couch and a sympathetic ear. She went very still and quiet before admitting she stopped going 2 years ago. The therapist kept telling her to let go of him and focus on James, which felt like betrayal every single session. She said she fired 3 different therapists for the same reason because they all wanted her to move on. But moving on meant he died for nothing. Her voice got louder and more frantic as she explained how the therapist didn't understand that she couldn't just forget him, couldn't just pretend those 4 years together didn't matter, couldn't just replace him with a new life like her parents wanted her to. I realized she'd been in a grief spiral for over a decade, with no professional help and no one willing to tell her the hard truth because everyone was too afraid she'd break completely. Rachel said the nonprofit felt like therapy at first, like doing something meaningful in his name would help her heal. But it became another way to avoid dealing with the actual grief. Another way to keep him alive instead of accepting he was gone. She said she knew she needed help, but she was terrified of what would happen if she actually let go, if she stopped visiting his grave 3 times a week and talking to him like he could answer. Rachel fell asleep on my couch mid-sentence, her words trailing off into nothing as exhaustion pulled her under. I sat there watching her sleep and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do now. I didn't invite her here to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. I invited her to discuss her ridiculous request for $50,000 and tell her no to her face. But now I was watching someone actively falling apart in my living room, someone who clearly hadn't slept properly in months or eaten a real meal in days. I grabbed a blanket from the closet and covered her, even though part of me wanted to wake her up and send her home to deal with her own mess. She didn't stir when I draped the blanket over her shoulders. I checked on James before going to bed myself and found him still awake, sitting up in bed with his nightlight on and his favorite stuffed dog clutched against his chest. He asked me if his mom was going to be okay, and I didn't know how to answer that question honestly without scaring him. I told him his mom was going through a really hard time, but she was getting help, and we'd figure it out together. He asked if she was sick like when people go to the hospital, and I said yes, sort of, but a different kind of sick that doctors couldn't fix with medicine. He seemed to accept this explanation and asked if she could stay for breakfast tomorrow. I said we'd see how she felt in the morning and told him to get some sleep because he had school tomorrow. James came downstairs early the next morning before his alarm went off and found Rachel still asleep on the couch in the exact same position I'd left her in last night. He stood in the doorway to the living room just watching her with an expression that broke my heart into pieces. Confusion mixed with concern, mixed with something that looked like guilt, like he thought maybe her problems were somehow his fault. I came up behind him and put my hand on his shoulder, and he jumped a little, startled out of whatever thoughts were running through his 7-year-old brain. He turned to me and asked in a whisper if his mom was sad because of him. The question hit me like a punch to the stomach because I realized he'd internalized some of Rachel's distance and absence as his own failure. I knelt down to his level and told him his mom had problems that had nothing to do with him, that sometimes adults struggled with things kids couldn't fix no matter how hard they tried. I said his mom loved him very much, but she'd been dealing with big sad feelings about someone who died a long time ago, and those feelings made it hard for her to be the mom she wanted to be. James looked at me with serious eyes and asked if loving someone meant being able to help them, and I told him honestly that no, sometimes loving someone just meant being there even when you couldn't fix their problems. Rachel woke up while James was eating cereal at the kitchen table, and she looked around my living room completely lost for a few seconds before remembering where she was. She sat up fast, and the blanket fell off her shoulders, and she looked embarrassed and horrified that she'd fallen asleep here. She started apologizing immediately, saying she needed to leave, that she was sorry for imposing, that she didn't mean to pass out on my couch like some kind of disaster. James surprised both of us by speaking up from the kitchen and asking if she wanted to stay for breakfast. Rachel looked at me for permission, and I could see hope and fear fighting in her expression. I nodded and told her we were making pancakes, and she was welcome to stay. The three of us sat at my kitchen table eating pancakes in awkward silence, broken only by James trying to make normal conversation. He told Rachel about his soccer team and his best friend at the school and the book he was reading for class. Rachel tried hard to engage with his stories, asking questions and nodding at the right times, but I could see how much effort it took her to be present, instead of lost in whatever dark thoughts usually occupied her mind. I watched her watching James and saw something shift in her face, like she was really seeing him for the first time in years, instead of seeing the name I took away from her. After breakfast, James went upstairs to brush his teeth and get his backpack ready for school, and Rachel asked if we could talk privately again. We returned to the living room for round 2 of difficult conversations, and she looked more awake now, more present than she'd been last night when exhaustion made her honest. She told me she wasn't asking for $50,000 anymore. She was asking for help figuring out how to stop destroying her life with this obsession that had consumed everything. She said she looked at James this morning, really looked at him, and realized she'd been absent for his entire childhood. She'd missed years she could never get back because she was too busy mourning someone who died before James was even born. Her voice cracked when she said she didn't know how to be his mother anymore, didn't know if she even deserved the chance to try after failing him so completely for so long. I told her I'd help her find a good therapist who specialized in complicated grief, someone who wouldn't just tell her to move on, but would actually help her process what she'd been avoiding for over a decade. But I made it clear I wasn't funding her memorial garden, and I wasn't enabling her obsession with him anymore. Rachel nodded and said she understood, that she knew the garden was just another way to avoid dealing with reality. She asked if she could see James more regularly, not just the weekends she usually skipped and work on actually being his mother, instead of a ghost who showed up occasionally. Rachel's request for more time with James triggered every protective instinct I had, and I told her she needed to get stable first, needed to prove she could be consistent and healthy before we changed any custody arrangements. She didn't argue or get defensive like I expected. She just asked what stable looked like to me, what she needed to do to earn more time with her son. I listed my requirements like I was reading terms and conditions. Regular therapy sessions with a grief specialist, maintaining steady employment, living in a safe and stable place, showing up for her scheduled visits without canceling last minute like she'd done dozens of times over the past 5 years. Rachel pulled out her phone and typed everything I said into her notes app, like she was taking notes for a test she was determined to pass. She asked if I thought she could do it, if I believed she was capable of getting better, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, but I hoped so for James's sake. I drove Rachel back to her apartment later that morning after dropping James at the school, and the disaster she'd been living in shocked me, even though I thought I was prepared. Boxes of his memorabilia covered every surface, photos and newspaper clippings and mementos from their relationship, taking up more space than actual furniture. Nonprofit paperwork buried the kitchen table and counters, financial statements and donor lists and event planning documents creating mountains of chaos. The fridge was practically empty, except for condiments and a half-gallon of milk that smelled sour when I checked the date. An eviction notice was taped to her front door dated for next week, and Rachel stood in the middle of the chaos looking completely defeated. She said she didn't know where to start fixing this mess, didn't know how to untangle years of bad decisions and obsessive behavior that led her here. I told her to start by calling her parents and asking for help closing down the nonprofit properly, handling the bankruptcy legally instead of just letting it implode. Rachel flinched like I'd suggested she murder him all over again. She said closing the nonprofit felt like admitting his death meant nothing, like everything she'd built in his memory was worthless and wrong. I reminded her that his death already meant something to the people who actually knew him, that she didn't need a failing organization to validate his life or their relationship. She looked around her apartment at all the boxes and papers and photos and started crying again, quiet tears that rolled down her face while she stood perfectly still in the center of her own disaster. Over the next week, Rachel called every other day with updates that surprised me. She met with a bankruptcy lawyer who explained her options for closing the nonprofit legally. She scheduled appointments with 3 different therapists and actually showed up to all of them before picking one who specialized in complicated grief. She asked her parents if she could move back temporarily while she got stable, and they agreed with conditions. Each call felt cautiously hopeful, but I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop because Rachel had promised change before only to disappear back into her obsession. James asked when his mom was coming over again, and the question caught me off guard. He'd never shown much interest in her visits before, usually just tolerating them with polite distance. But something shifted when he saw her broken and vulnerable in our living room. She seemed more real to him than the distant, sad woman who occasionally remembered she had a son. I decided to do my own research on Rachel's nonprofit while James was at the school. The website looked professional enough at first glance, but digging deeper revealed disaster. The financial statements posted online showed donations coming in, but the spending allocations made no sense. Money designated for motorcycle safety programs got redirected to memorial projects. A scholarship fund for accident victims' families had been emptied to pay for a bronze statue. The board members page showed 5 empty positions with resignation dates spanning the last 8 months. I found a local news article about donors demanding refunds after discovering their contributions funded Christopher memorials instead of the safety programs they thought they were supporting. 3 former board members were quoted expressing concern about financial mismanagement and possible fraud. And I clicked through to the state charity registration database and found the nonprofit status listed as under investigation. Rachel hadn't just made bad choices driven by grief. She'd potentially committed fraud, taken money under false pretenses, violated donor trust and state regulations. This wasn't just bankruptcy territory anymore. This was criminal investigation territory. I called Rachel immediately, and she picked up on the first ring sounding almost cheerful until I asked about the financial irregularities. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she started crying, not the desperate sobbing from before, but quieter tears that sounded like shame. She admitted she knew she was misusing funds, but convinced herself it was okay, because everything honored Christopher's memory. She told herself the memorial projects would attract major donors who'd see how beautiful the tributes were and want to contribute to the safety programs. But it never worked that way. The memorials cost more than anticipated. Donors got angry when they learned the truth. Board members quit when she wouldn't listen to their concerns. She kept thinking one more project would fix everything. One more tribute would make it all worthwhile. One more memorial would finally ease the grief enough that she could function. I told her she needed to disclose everything to the bankruptcy lawyer immediately, because this could become criminal. She sounded terrified, asking if she could go to jail. I said I didn't know, but hiding it would definitely make things worse. She promised she'd call the lawyer first thing in the morning and tell him everything. Frederick called me 2 hours later, sounding exhausted and angry. Rachel had shown up at their house talking about bankruptcy and fraud investigations and needing to move home. He wanted to know what the hell was going on, because this sounded worse than anything Rachel had told them before. I explained what I'd found about the nonprofit, the misused funds, the investigation, the potential criminal charges. Frederick went quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was flat and defeated. He said they knew Rachel was obsessed with Christopher, but didn't realize it had gotten this bad. They thought the nonprofit was actually helping people, that Rachel had finally found a healthy way to channel her grief into something positive. He sounded like a man who'd just discovered his daughter's problems were far worse than he'd imagined. Frederick asked if he could come talk to me in person. He said there were things about Rachel and Christopher I didn't know, things that might help me understand why she spiraled so completely. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop the next day. James had soccer practice that afternoon, so I arranged for another parent to take him while I met with Frederick. I was curious what context could possibly justify Rachel's behavior, but I was willing to listen. Maybe understanding how she got here would help figure out how to help James navigate having a mother who was falling apart in increasingly serious ways. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. Frederick sat in a corner booth looking older than I remembered, his face lined with worry and something that looked like guilt. He ordered black coffee and stared at it for a full minute before starting to talk. He told me the full story of Rachel and Christopher's relationship starting from when they met. Rachel was 17, a high school senior with college acceptance letters and a bright future. Christopher was 19, working at a motorcycle shop after dropping out of community college. Frederick and his wife Viola never approved of the relationship. They saw Christopher as reckless and immature, someone who'd drag Rachel down from her potential. Viola begged Rachel to break up with him multiple times, especially after Christopher quit college completely to work full-time as a mechanic. When Christopher proposed to Rachel during her senior year of college, Frederick and Viola refused to support any wedding. They threatened to cut her off financially if she married him. Frederick admitted something that made my stomach turn. He said they were relieved when Christopher died. Relieved. Because it meant Rachel wouldn't ruin her life by marrying someone with no ambition and a dangerous hobby. They encouraged her to move on quickly, to focus on her physical therapy career. to put the relationship behind her like it was a phase she'd grown out of. They introduced her to me 6 months after Christopher's death. Frederick looked me in the eye and said they thought a stable professional man would help her forget about the motorcycle mechanic. They pushed us together at family gatherings, talked me up to Rachel, basically orchestrated our relationship because they wanted her with someone they approved of. Frederick said they had no idea Rachel was still grieving so intensely because she hid it from them. She was afraid they'd say I told you so about Christopher being wrong for her. I sat there processing the fact that Rachel's parents had pushed her toward me as a replacement for Christopher. Our entire relationship was built on their desire for her to move on before she was ready. I was part of their plan to erase her grief, to substitute an acceptable man for the unacceptable one she'd loved. Frederick saw my expression and said they thought they were helping her. Prolonged grief wasn't healthy. She needed to build a new life. I told him they taught Rachel to hide her feelings instead of process them. They made her grief shameful instead of helping her work through it. And now everyone was paying the price for that repression. Me with a marriage destroyed by lies. James with a mother too broken to parent him. Rachel with potential criminal charges because her untreated grief turned into obsession. Frederick asked what I wanted him to do. Should he let Rachel move home? Should he help with the bankruptcy? Should he support more therapy or practice tough love? I told him Rachel needed actual support, not judgment disguised as concern. That meant acknowledging they pushed her to move on too fast. That meant accepting they contributed to this disaster by making her grief something to hide and overcome instead of something to process and integrate. Frederick looked uncomfortable but nodded. He admitted he and Viola made mistakes in how they handled Rachel's grief after Christopher died. He said they'd talk to Rachel's therapist about family sessions if that would help. I told him it probably would because Rachel's issues weren't just about Christopher dying. They were about a family that couldn't handle her grief and a marriage built on a lie. James asked me that evening why Grandpa Frederick came to talk to me. I realized he was picking up on all the adult tension and secret conversations happening around him. Kids always know when something's wrong even if they don't understand what. I told him his mom was getting help for some problems she'd had for a long time. Sometimes that meant lots of grown-ups talking about how to help. He asked if the problems were about him. I assured him they weren't, that his mom's problems started before he was born and had nothing to do with anything he did or didn't do. But I could see he didn't fully believe me. He had that look kids get when they know adults are hiding something important. I picked up my phone on Wednesday evening and saw Rachel's name on the screen. My finger hovered over the decline button out of habit, but something made me answer. Her voice sounded different, clearer, less frantic than the last time we'd talked. She told me she met with the bankruptcy lawyer that afternoon, and he laid out a plan for closing the nonprofit legally without criminal charges. She'd also started seeing a grief specialist twice a week. The therapist specialized in complicated grief and loss. Rachel said her parents agreed to let her move back home this weekend while she got stable. Then she asked if she could take James for a few hours on Saturday. Not overnight, just to spend time together. She promised to be fully present with him. No distractions, no emotional breakdowns. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and weighing the risk. James deserved to see his mom making genuine effort. I told her yes, but only for 3 hours at the park. She thanked me 3 times before hanging up. Her gratitude sounded real instead of desperate. Saturday morning, James bounced around the house excited to see his mom. He asked if she would play soccer with him, and I told him to bring his ball just in case. Rachel pulled up exactly on time, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of her usual rumpled clothes. She looked like she'd slept. Actually slept. James ran to her car and climbed in, talking about his week at the school. I watched them drive away and forced myself not to text her every 30 minutes. 3 hours later, they returned, and James burst through the door talking nonstop about the park. Rachel had played soccer with him for almost an hour. She helped him across the monkey bars when his hands got tired. They got ice cream, and she listened to all his stories about his science project and the new kid in his class. He kept saying his mom seemed like a regular mom today. Normal. Fun. After James went upstairs to play, Rachel stood on my porch looking uncertain. She thanked me again for trusting her with the visit. Said it reminded her what she'd been missing all these years while she was buried in nonprofit work and Christopher's memory. I nodded and told her I was glad it went well. She drove away, and 20 minutes later my phone buzzed with a text saying she couldn't stop thinking about how much of James's childhood she'd missed. The next month brought changes I didn't expect. Rachel showed up for every scheduled visit with James. She attended his soccer games and cheered from the sidelines. She texted me updates after her therapy appointments without me asking. The bankruptcy proceedings moved forward, and she cooperated fully with the lawyers. James started talking about his mom more at dinner, how she taught him a new card game, how she remembered his favorite pizza toppings, how she asked about his friends by name. One Wednesday evening, Rachel called and said her therapist suggested family therapy for the 3 of us, to address the name change situation and Rachel's years of absence, to help James understand his history in a way that made sense for a 7-year-old. I sat at my kitchen table thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. But James deserved to know the truth about his name and his mom's grief. He deserved professional help processing the complicated family he'd been born into. I told Rachel I'd agree to family therapy if she maintained her current stability. She promised she would. The therapist's office had blue walls and comfortable couches. Trent Esposito introduced himself and shook James's hand like he was meeting an adult. James sat between Rachel and me looking nervous. His feet didn't quite reach the floor. Trent asked gentle questions about our family and what brought us to therapy. Rachel started crying when he asked about Christopher. Her shoulders shook and she grabbed tissues from the box on the side table. James looked confused and scared. He'd never heard that name before except buried in family stories he didn't understand. Trent noticed James's expression and spoke directly to him. He explained that before James was James, his name used to be Christopher. His mom had picked that name for someone very special to her who died before James was born, someone she loved very much. James's eyes went wide, and he looked at me like I'd been keeping secrets, which I had been, for 5 years. James asked why I changed his name if his mom picked it. The question hung in the air, and I struggled to find words a 7-year-old would understand. I told him I changed it because I didn't know why his mom chose Christopher until later. That sometimes information changes how we feel about decisions. Trent jumped in and helped me explain that parents make choices they think are best at the time, but later realized those choices were more complicated than they seemed. James processed this, and then asked if Christopher was a bad person. Rachel said no immediately. Said Christopher was wonderful and kind and would have loved James so much. I felt my jaw tighten because I didn't want her romanticizing her dead ex-boyfriend to our son. Didn't want James growing up thinking he was named after some perfect saint instead of a real flawed person who happened to die young. Trent redirected the conversation away from Christopher's story and toward James's feelings. He asked James how it felt knowing he had 2 names in his history. James thought about it and said he liked being James. He didn't remember being Christopher at all, but he felt bad that his mom was sad about the name change. Trent leaned forward and spoke gently to James. He told him that his mom's sadness wasn't his responsibility, that adults have to handle their own feelings, that James could love his mom without fixing her problems or making her feel better about things that happened before he could even remember. I watched James absorb this and saw some tension leave his small shoulders. He'd been carrying guilt he didn't know how to name. After the session ended, Rachel asked if we could talk briefly in the hallway. James went to the waiting room to look at books. Rachel stood against the wall and admitted that hearing James say he doesn't remember being Christopher felt like losing Christopher all over again, like the last piece of him disappeared. But she knew that was her issue to work through in individual therapy, not something to put on James. She thanked me for agreeing to family therapy, even though I had every right to refuse after everything she'd done. Said she was starting to understand how much damage her grief caused to everyone around her, how she'd hurt James and me by never dealing with Christopher's death properly. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that I could see her trying, that her effort mattered more than I expected it to. My phone rang Tuesday afternoon while I was working from home. The school counselor Penelope Munoz introduced herself and asked if I could come in for a meeting. She'd noticed changes in James's behavior over the past few weeks. He'd been distracted in class, asking other kids questions about their parents' divorces, drawing pictures during art time of families with missing people, stick figures with question marks where faces should be. I drove to the school that afternoon and sat across from Penelope in her small office filled with books and stress balls. I explained the family therapy situation and Rachel's recent involvement in James's life. Penelope nodded and said this was common. Kids process their parents' issues through their behavior and their art. They work out confusing feelings by asking questions and drawing pictures that adults might find concerning. She recommended continuing therapy and maintaining stable routines at home. Said James needed consistency while he worked through his complicated family history. That evening, I sat with James while he did homework and asked if he wanted to talk about anything. About his mom or his name or the therapy sessions. He shrugged and kept working on his math problems. I told him he could ask me anything without getting in trouble or making me upset, that I wanted him to feel safe asking hard questions. He put down his pencil and asked if his mom loved Christopher more than she loved him. The question hit me like a punch. I took a breath and told him honestly that his mom loved Christopher differently because Christopher was her boyfriend. But that didn't mean she loved James any less. Different kinds of love for different people. He seemed to accept this, but then asked if I ever worried his mom would leave again. Stop coming to his games and visits. Go back to being sad and distant. I realized he'd been carrying fears about abandonment that I hadn't fully recognized. Worries that his mom's recent presence was temporary. Rachel's sister Sydney called me Friday morning while I was making coffee. I didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. She introduced herself and asked if we could meet for lunch because she had things to tell me about Rachel and Christopher that might help me understand the current situation. I was tired of family members appearing with secret information, tired of learning new pieces of Rachel's history from everyone except Rachel herself. But I agreed to meet Sydney at a restaurant downtown. She showed up exactly on time, younger than Rachel by 5 years, direct eyes and no-nonsense posture. She sat across from me and ordered coffee, and wasted no time telling me that our family enabled Rachel's unhealthy grief for years. That everyone knew Rachel was stuck, but nobody knew how to help her move forward. That watching Rachel destroy herself over Christopher had been painful for the whole family. Sydney pulled her coffee cup closer and stared at it for a moment before speaking again. She told me that after Christopher died, Rachel completely shut down for almost 4 months. She stopped eating anything except what her parents forced down her throat. She stopped going to her college classes. She stopped showering unless someone physically walked her to the bathroom. She talked constantly about wanting to die so she could be with Christopher, about how wrong it felt that she was still breathing when he wasn't. Frederick and Viola got her into intensive therapy 3 times a week and put her on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. Rachel gradually started functioning again, going through the motions of normal life, returning to classes, graduating on time. But Sydney said Rachel never actually dealt with the grief in any real way. She just learned how to hide it better, how to act normal enough that everyone stopped worrying. Their parents were so relieved to see Rachel eating and dressing and going to class that they didn't push for deeper healing. They accepted surface-level recovery and moved on. Sydney leaned back in her chair and said their whole family made a terrible mistake by letting Rachel pretend she was fine when she clearly wasn't. Sydney took a breath and told me something that made my stomach turn. When Rachel started dating me, she called Sydney crying one night saying she felt guilty about moving on from Christopher. But Frederick and Viola were so happy about me that Rachel convinced herself maybe it was okay to try again. Rachel apparently told Sydney I was safe and stable, everything Christopher wasn't with his motorcycles and his mechanic job and his reckless streak. Maybe dating someone so different meant she was ready for a new chapter. Sydney said she warned Rachel not to marry me until she'd properly grieved Christopher, until she'd done the real work of letting him go. But Rachel got defensive and accused Sydney of trying to sabotage her happiness, of wanting her to stay miserable forever. Sydney backed off because she didn't want to lose her sister completely. She watched Rachel marry me knowing it was built on a foundation of unprocessed grief and lies. I asked Sydney why she was telling me all this now, why she was sharing family secrets years after everything fell apart. Sydney looked me straight in the eye and said, because Rachel was finally getting real help, finally hitting the rock bottom she needed to face her grief honestly, instead of running from it. Sydney wanted me to understand that Rachel's deception wasn't some calculated evil plan. It was someone trying desperately to be normal when she was fundamentally broken inside. Rachel naming James after Christopher was her unconscious mind's way of keeping Christopher in her life when her conscious mind was trying to move on. I appreciated Sydney's honesty. I really did. But I told her that understanding Rachel's psychology didn't change the facts. Rachel lied to me for years. Rachel used our son as a living memorial to her dead boyfriend. Understanding why she did it didn't erase the damage it caused to me and to James. Sydney nodded and said, I had every right to be angry, that she wasn't asking me to forgive Rachel, or forget what happened. But she asked me to consider that Rachel's current breakdown might be the crisis she needed to finally face her grief honestly. She said their whole family had been waiting for Rachel to hit bottom for years, knowing she couldn't heal until she stopped pretending everything was fine. Sydney looked tired when she said it, like she'd been carrying this weight for a decade. I realized Sydney was asking me to have some compassion for Rachel's journey, even though Rachel's choices had hurt me and James badly. Sydney finished her coffee and said Rachel was her sister, and she loved her. But she also knew Rachel had been living a lie for 10 years, and that lie had poisoned everything it touched. James had a complete meltdown at bedtime that night. He was supposed to be brushing his teeth, but instead he sat on the bathroom floor and started crying, asking me why families had to be so complicated. Why couldn't his mom just be normal like other kids' moms who showed up to the school events and remembered to call on birthdays and didn't spend all their time being sad about things that happened before he was born? I sat on the floor next to him and let him cry, not trying to fix it or make it better, just being there. I told him that all families were complicated in different ways, that some kids had parents who fought all the time, some had parents who were never home, some had parents dealing with big problems like his mom was. His mom was working hard to be healthier, going to therapy, trying to be more present in his life. I told him it was okay to feel frustrated and sad about things being difficult. He asked me if I was sad too, and I admitted honestly that yes, I was sad about how things turned out. But I was also hopeful that things could get better for all of us, if everyone kept trying. The next family therapy session with Trent focused on helping James express his feelings about Rachel's inconsistency over the years. Trent asked James to tell his mom about times when he felt was forgotten or unimportant, and I watched my 7-year-old son struggle to put complicated emotions into words. James told Rachel he used to make up stories about why she canceled visits. He convinced himself she was busy saving lives at the hospital or helping people who really needed her because it hurt less than thinking she just didn't want to see him. He said sometimes he pretended she was a superhero with important missions, because that made more sense than a mom who chose memorial bike rides over spending time with her kid. Rachel was openly crying, but Trent kept redirecting her to listen, rather than defend herself or apologize yet. I watched Rachel's face as she truly heard the impact of her grief-driven absence, saw her realize that her son had been protecting himself from feeling unwanted for years. Rachel told James she was sorry for not being the mom he deserved, that she'd been dealing with very big, sad feelings that made it hard for her to be present. But that wasn't his fault, and he didn't do anything wrong. Her voice was shaking when she said it. James asked if she was going to keep being sad forever, and Rachel paused before answering. She said she would probably always have some sadness about Christopher, but she was learning how to not let that sadness take over her whole life. She was learning that loving someone who died didn't mean she had to stop living herself. Trent stepped in and validated James's concerns while helping him understand that his mom's healing was a process that would take time. There wouldn't be one magic moment where everything was suddenly fixed. But Rachel was doing the work now, and that mattered. After several weeks of family therapy and Rachel maintaining consistent stability, she asked if we could modify the custody arrangement. She wanted to add one weeknight dinner per week in addition to her weekend visits. I felt my protective instincts kick in immediately because I didn't want James getting hurt again if Rachel couldn't maintain this progress. But Trent supported the idea, as long as Rachel kept up her current path of therapy and stability. I agreed to a trial period of Wednesday dinners at my house. Rachel would come over, we'd eat together as a family, and she'd leave after helping James with homework. No overnights yet, just a few hours of supervised family time to see if she could handle the consistency. The Wednesday dinners were awkward at first, with all of us trying too hard to act normal. Rachel asked James about his day at the school, and he gave one-word answers while pushing food around his plate. I made small talk about the weather and upcoming soccer games. But gradually over the following weeks, things became more comfortable. Rachel started actually helping with James's math homework, instead of just sitting there watching. She played board games with him before she left, laughing at his jokes and trash talk during Uno. James started looking forward to Wednesdays, asking me that morning what we were having for dinner, and if his mom was definitely coming. One Wednesday, he asked if his mom could come to his soccer games on Saturdays, and I looked at Rachel to see if she was ready for that commitment. She nodded eagerly. I agreed, and Rachel showed up to every single game after that, standing on the sidelines cheering and yelling encouragement. I saw James's face light up when he spotted his mom in the crowd, saw him play harder knowing she was there watching him. Rachel's bankruptcy got finalized 3 months after she moved in with her parents. The nonprofit officially closed, and she had to repay some debts through a payment plan. But she avoided criminal charges because she cooperated fully with the investigation and showed genuine remorse. Frederick and Viola helped her get a part-time job as a physical therapy assistant at a clinic near their house while she worked on getting her full license back. She had to complete additional training and supervision hours, but the clinic owner was willing to give her a chance. Rachel moved into a small apartment near her parents' place, nothing fancy but clean and safe. She invited James to see it one Saturday, showing him the bedroom she'd set up for him with blue walls and posters of his favorite soccer players. James seemed happy about having his own space at his mom's place, asking if he could bring some of his toys over for when he visited. I got a call from someone named Benjamin Lowry 2 weeks after Rachel's bankruptcy finalized. He said he was Christopher's younger brother and asked if we could meet because his parents wanted to talk to me about Rachel's memorial garden project. I felt confused about why they'd reach out to me instead of Rachel, but I agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown on Saturday morning. I walked in expecting younger people, but Darren and Elizabeth Lowry looked to be in their late 60s, with gray hair and tired eyes that carried years of grief. They stood when I approached their table and shook my hand with formal politeness before we all sat down. Elizabeth got straight to the point without any small talk. She said they never wanted Rachel to build a memorial garden for Christopher. Darren nodded and added that they'd been trying to distance themselves from Rachel's projects for years, but she kept using their names and saying everything was to honor their wishes. Elizabeth explained that Rachel had been turning Christopher into some perfect saint instead of remembering him as the real person he was, flawed, but loved. She said the nonprofit and all the memorial projects made them deeply uncomfortable from the start because it felt like Rachel was using Christopher's death as an excuse to avoid moving forward with her own life. Darren leaned forward and said Rachel kept invoking their names at fundraisers and in grant applications, claiming they supported her work when they'd actually asked her multiple times to stop. Elizabeth's voice got harder when she talked about how Rachel's obsession made it impossible for them to grieve privately, how every memorial ride and awareness campaign felt like their son's memory was used for something that had nothing to do with who he actually was. I sat there processing this information and realized Rachel had been lying about Christopher's parents supporting her work, just like she'd lied about who Christopher was to her. I took a breath and told them about Rachel naming our son Christopher without ever mentioning that Christopher was her ex-boyfriend, that she'd let me believe he was just a childhood friend. Elizabeth's hand went to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. Darren went completely still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Elizabeth said they had absolutely no idea Rachel had done that if they'd known they would have stepped in immediately because using a living child as a memorial was deeply wrong and unhealthy. Darren set his cup down carefully and said they'd been worried about Rachel for years, but didn't know how to help someone who seemed determined to stay frozen in grief. He said they'd tried talking to her parents, Frederick and Viola, but everyone seemed afraid to confront Rachel directly about her obsession. Elizabeth wiped her eyes and said she felt sick, knowing a little boy had been named after their son without understanding the full context, that it must have been horrible for me to discover the truth that way. I told them I'd changed James's name after the divorce, and they both nodded like that made perfect sense. We sat in silence for a moment before Elizabeth asked if they could meet James someday. She said quickly that they didn't want to insert themselves into his life or confuse him, but they'd like to share some real stories about Christopher with him, about the funny and reckless and kind person their son actually was, instead of the perfect memory Rachel had created. Darren added that James deserved to know the truth about the person he'd been named after, not some fantasy version. I felt uncertain about this request because it seemed complicated to bring Christopher's parents into James's life when we were just starting to stabilize things with Rachel. I told them I needed to think about it and discuss it with Rachel and our family therapist Trent before making any decisions. Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed my hand, thanking me for listening and saying she hoped Rachel would finally get real help so she could be present for her son. Darren stood and shook my hand again, saying they appreciated me meeting with them and that they'd be available whenever I was ready to talk more. I brought up the Lowry meeting in our next family therapy session 3 days later. Rachel's face went pale when I mentioned their names, and she immediately got defensive, saying they didn't understand what she'd been trying to do with the memorial work. Trent let her talk for a minute before gently redirecting her to actually hear what the Lowrys had said. He asked Rachel to consider that maybe her memorial projects weren't really about honoring Christopher, but about keeping herself stuck in grief so she didn't have to face his death. Rachel's hands started shaking, and she said she'd been afraid that letting go of the memorial work would mean Christopher died for nothing, that all his potential and goodness would just disappear. Trent leaned forward and asked her to think about whether Christopher's life had meaning because of who he was as a person or because of what she built in his name. Rachel started crying and admitted she'd been so focused on creating monuments that she'd stopped thinking about Christopher as a real person with flaws and mistakes and ordinary moments. Trent suggested that maybe the best way to honor Christopher would be to live her own life fully and be the mother James needed instead of building more memorials. Rachel nodded slowly and said she was willing to meet with the Lowrys if Trent would be there to help mediate the conversation. I agreed, and Trent scheduled a joint session for the following week. The session with the Lowrys was intense from the moment they walked into Trent's office. Elizabeth and Darren sat across from Rachel while I sat slightly to the side, and Trent positioned himself where he could see everyone. Elizabeth started by saying they appreciated that Rachel had loved Christopher, but they needed her to understand that making his death the center of her entire identity wasn't healthy for anyone involved. Darren said they'd watched Rachel turn their son into something he never was, a perfect martyr instead of a regular guy who rode motorcycles too fast and dropped out of college and worked with his hands. Rachel sobbed and apologized for appropriating their grief, for using Christopher's memory in ways that served her needs, instead of actually honoring who he was. She admitted she'd made Christopher into a symbol instead of remembering him as a person, because the symbol was easier to live with than the complicated reality of losing someone she loved. Elizabeth's expression softened, and she said Christopher would have wanted Rachel to be happy, to be a good mother, to build a real life instead of endless shrines to his memory. Rachel broke down completely, saying she'd been so terrified of forgetting Christopher that she'd forgotten how to actually live. Elizabeth moved to sit next to Rachel and put an arm around her shoulders while Rachel cried. Darren said quietly that grief was supposed to change over time, that holding on to it so tightly just turned it into something toxic that poisoned everything around it. They talked for another hour about healthy ways to remember Christopher, about how Rachel could honor his memory by living well and loving James completely instead of building more monuments. Everyone agreed Rachel needed to continue therapy and focus on being present for her son, and that the Memorial Garden project should be permanently abandoned. James came home from the school one afternoon about 2 weeks later and asked if we could visit the place where Christopher used to ride his motorcycle. He said he'd been thinking about the person he was named after and wanted to see where Christopher spent time. I felt surprised by the request, but told James I'd talk to Trent about it. Trent thought it could actually be helpful for James to have concrete information instead of mysterious gaps in his family history. I called Rachel and suggested the three of us visit the park together so she could share some real stories about Christopher with James. Rachel agreed immediately, and we planned to go that Saturday. The park was bigger than I expected, with paved paths winding through trees and open fields. Rachel led us to a section with smooth pavement, where she said Christopher used to practice tricks on his motorcycle. James asked what kind of tricks, and Rachel smiled, describing how Christopher could do wheelies and how he'd once crashed trying to impress her and scraped up his whole left side. James laughed and asked what else Christopher was like. Rachel sat on a bench and James sat next to her while I stood nearby. She told James that Christopher was funny and made terrible jokes that still made people laugh, that he was kind to animals and always stopped to help stray dogs, that he loved working on motorcycles and could fix almost anything mechanical. James listened carefully and then asked if Rachel was still sad about Christopher. Rachel took a breath and said yes. She still missed Christopher sometimes, but she was learning that being sad about someone who died didn't mean you couldn't be happy about people who were alive. She said she'd made a mistake by letting her sadness take over everything, but she was working hard to change that. James seemed satisfied with this answer and asked if we could get ice cream. The three of us walked to an ice cream shop near the park and sat at an outdoor table eating our cones. Rachel told more stories about Christopher, regular human stories about him being late to everything and forgetting important dates and singing off-key in the car. James smiled and asked questions, and I watched Rachel share memories that felt genuine instead of worshipped. 6 months had passed since Rachel showed up at my door, looking like she was falling apart. She'd maintained steady progress through all of it, going to therapy every week without missing appointments, working consistently at the physical therapy clinic, showing up for every scheduled visit with James. The Wednesday dinners had become a comfortable routine, and Rachel proved she could be present and engaged with James instead of distant and distracted. Her apartment stayed clean and organized, she paid her bills on time, and she stopped talking about Christopher constantly. Penelope called from James's school to say his behavior had completely normalized, that he seemed happier and more settled than he'd been in years. I met with my lawyer to discuss modifying the custody arrangement. We drew up new papers giving Rachel Wednesday dinners and alternating weekends, instead of just the limited visits she'd had before. Rachel cried when I showed her the proposed modification and thanked me for trusting her enough to give her more time with James. The judge approved the new arrangement without any objections, since Rachel had demonstrated consistent stability and appropriate boundaries. James was excited about spending more time with his mom and started keeping some of his favorite toys and books at her apartment. One Wednesday evening about 2 months later, Rachel showed up for dinner carrying a folded piece of paper in her hands. James was setting the table and didn't notice the way Rachel kept touching the paper like it might disappear. She helped him arrange the plates and forks, made small talk about his day at the school, but I could see something was different in how she held herself. After we sat down to eat, Rachel cleared her throat and asked if we could talk after James finished his homework. I nodded and watched her tuck the paper into her purse with careful hands. James ate his spaghetti and told us about the science project he was working on, something about volcanoes, and Rachel listened with real attention instead of the distant look she used to have. When James went upstairs to work on math problems, Rachel pulled the paper back out and smoothed it flat on the table. She told me her therapist had been helping her write something, that it took weeks to get the words right, and she wanted to know if I was willing to hear it. I said yes, even though part of me wanted to say no, wanted to protect myself from whatever this was going to be. Rachel unfolded the paper and started reading in a voice that shook at first, but got steadier as she went. She said she understood now that lying about Christopher's name was a betrayal, that hiding their relationship and her grief was wrong, that she'd put a dead man ahead of her living husband and son. She talked about how she'd made me compete with a ghost, how she'd turned James into a memorial instead of loving him as himself, how she'd destroyed our marriage through years of deception. She didn't make excuses or try to explain it away, just stated clearly what she'd done and why it was wrong. She said she was committed to being better, to being the mother James deserved, to processing her grief in healthy ways instead of letting it consume everything. When she finished reading, she folded the paper back up and looked at me with eyes that were wet but not crying. I sat there for a minute trying to figure out what to say, because the apology felt real in a way nothing else from Rachel had felt in years. I told her I appreciated her saying all that I could see she'd genuinely changed over the past months, and that mattered for James's sake, even if I couldn't forget what happened. We talked about keeping the current custody arrangement, about continuing family therapy once a month to work through issues as they came up, about being respectful co-parents who both wanted what was best for our son. Rachel asked if maybe someday we could be friends again, and I told her honestly that I didn't know about that, but we could definitely be good co-parents who treated each other with respect. She nodded like that answer was enough, like she hadn't expected more than that anyway. A few days later, James came home from the school and flopped on the couch next to me while I was checking work emails. He said he was glad his mom was around more now, that he liked having both parents even if we weren't married anymore. I put my phone down and looked at him. This kid who'd adjusted to our complicated family better than I'd feared he would. He asked if he could invite his mom to his birthday party next month, and I agreed right away because Rachel had earned the right to be there for these moments. James grinned and started planning out the party, listing all his friends he wanted to invite, talking about games and cake flavors. That weekend, Rachel came over, and the three of us sat at my kitchen table planning James's 8th birthday party together, his first birthday with both parents there since he turned 1. Rachel suggested we do it at the park, where there was more space for kids to run around, and James got excited about having relay races and a water balloon fight. We made lists and divided up tasks, Rachel handling decorations, and I'd take care of food, and it felt strange but good to be working together on something for James, instead of fighting through lawyers. The day of the party arrived sunny and warm, perfect weather for a park celebration. I got there early to set up tables, and Rachel showed up right after with boxes of decorations and streamers. We worked together hanging birthday banners and setting out plates while James ran around with the first kids who arrived. I watched Rachel help organize relay race teams, saw her laughing with James's friends as they competed, noticed how natural she seemed with the kids in a way I hadn't seen from her in years. She cut the cake and served pieces to everyone, made sure all the kids got equal amounts of frosting, cleaned up spills without getting frustrated. James was having the time of his life, surrounded by friends and both his parents actually being present and involved. Rachel caught my eye from across the yard while she was helping a kid tie his shoe, and she smiled at me with real warmth instead of the sad distance that used to define her. I nodded back at her, acknowledging silently how far all three of us had come from that terrible night when she'd shown up at my door looking destroyed. When it was time for cake, all the kids gathered around James while we lit the candles, and he stood there grinning with his mom on one side and me on the other. He blew out all 8 candles in one breath, and everyone cheered, and I looked at our little family that didn't look anything like I'd imagined it would, but somehow worked anyway. We'd built something real from all the lies and grief and anger, something honest and functional, even if it wasn't perfect. And watching James's happy face surrounded by friends and both his parents, I realized that was enough.